In the spring of 2009, a ceramics quality consultant named Douglas Fenn drove out to a property on the edge of Meade County, Kentucky, to settle what he considered a minor administrative matter. The factory where he worked had been depositing its cold tile along the fence line of a neighboring parcel for years, a practice the plant ownership had allowed as a quiet, mutual convenience, a way of clearing the reject bins without paying landfill fees, and a way of filling a low spot along the tree line on the neighboring land. The arrangement had never been formalized. It had simply continued season after season, the way informal agreements do in rural counties when nobody objects and nobody asks too many questions. Fenn expected to find a mess. What he found instead stopped him at the fence for a long moment before he called out. The tile had not been hauled away, the way other neighbors along the county road sometimes hauled away material from the line. It had been sorted, stacked by color into shallow wooden crates that ran along the fence in a line nearly 200 feet long. The broken pieces had been separated from the intact rejects. The warped pieces occupied their own section. The color-shifted seconds formed another. The man who had done all of this sorting was named Warren Creel, and he was 61 years old, and he was not embarrassed. Fenn called it a hobby. He said it clearly, standing in his company jacket with a clipboard under his arm, and he used the word with a particular kind of gentleness, the kind that means two people understand each other perfectly, and one of them is being polite about it. The factory intended to pave the dump line, he explained, install a proper removal system. The informal arrangement would be discontinued. He was sorry for the inconvenience. Warren thanked him and asked one question, which was whether the seconds might be available for purchase at scrap weight pricing rather than removed by the factory's contractor. Fenn said he doubted that would be practical. Warren said he understood. He watched Fenn drive back out the gravel lane in his company truck, and then he went inside. 13 years later, in the summer of 2022, a regional hotel group paid Warren Creel and his grandson Cole $47,000 for a Mosaic tile installation in a Louisville lobby, 640 square feet of assembled ceramic that had been built from factory seconds, purchased at 6 cents per pound. The material cost for the entire installation was $214. That is the distance this video will walk from the fence line in Meade County where Douglas Fenn saw a hobby to the invoice that told a different story. The walk takes time because what Warren Creel was doing for those 13 years was not simple, and understanding why it worked requires understanding what he actually knew. Warren had grown up 4 miles from the tile plant, in a house his grandfather Elias built from poured concrete block in 1947. Elias Creel had been among the first from the county to hire on at the plant when it opened, working first as a pressman, then as a line lead, and finally, for the last decade of his career, as shift foreman on the pressing operation. He retired in 1975, and the retirement party was held in the break room with a sheet cake from a grocery in Brandenburg. He carried 2 things out of the plant on his last day. The first was a cracked leather observation journal he had kept since his 2nd year on the floor, a document that had accumulated in cramped handwriting across 2 decades of watching ceramic fail in ways the production sheet did not have a column for. The second was a conviction he had never quite been able to explain to the plant's managers, which was that what came out of the reject bin was not waste. It was a record. Every cracked bisque and off-color glaze and warped body that failed to meet the specification told you something about the process that the passing tile could not, because the passing tile had been sorted away from its own variation. The seconds were what remained when you asked the question honestly. Elias was not an academic man. He had not had the vocabulary for what he was observing. He simply wrote it down, plant floor observation by observation, in cramped handwriting that filled the journal over 2 decades, and that Warren had read so many times by the time he was 40, that the passages had settled into something that felt like personal memory rather than inherited text. Let me tell you what Warren understood from that journal, because it is the mechanism that made everything else possible, and it is not sentimental. A ceramic tile fails during production in ways that fall into distinct categories, and each category tells you something specific. A body that cracks during bisque firing, the first high-temperature pass, cracked because moisture remained in the core, while the exterior densified faster in the heat. Cracking of that kind is a moisture and clay plasticity problem, and it means the clay body had either been mixed inconsistently or moved through the kiln too quickly. A glaze that crawls, pulling back from the surface in small islands, crawled because the glaze coat was applied over surface contamination, or because the thermal expansion rates of the body and the glaze were mismatched enough that the glaze pulled away as the piece cooled. Color inconsistency in a single production run meant the kiln atmosphere had varied, shifting from oxidizing conditions in one zone to reducing conditions in another, which changed the chemistry of the iron or copper oxides in the colorant and produced tiles that shaded from one hue to another within the same batch. These were not anomalies. They were physics. They were reproducible because the conditions that created them were reproducible, which meant they were predictable to someone who had spent enough time reading them. What Elias had understood, and what he had passed to Warren through the journal, was that the reject bin contained a kind of ceramic knowledge that the production line was structurally unable to generate, because the production line's purpose was elimination. It was built to find the variation and discard it. Elias had spent 22 years reading the discarded variation. Warren had spent the next 30 years applying what he read. Warren set his first crates in the barn around 1996, when he was still working full-time as a tile setter for residential contractors in Meade and Hardin counties. He drove a 10-year-old pickup and set tile 5 days a week in new construction and in renovation, and in the evenings and on weekends he sorted what came off the factory's fence line and stacked it in the barn by color, by defect type, by glaze character. The sorting took time. It required the same careful attention that Elias had applied on the plant floor, the same willingness to look at a piece and ask what had happened to it, rather than whether it met a standard. He bought a wet saw from an estate sale in Elizabethtown in 2001. He found a book on Roman Mosaic technique at a used bookstore in Louisville and read it twice. He built a work table from salvaged lumber and began cutting. A neighbor named Dale Hopper saw the first finished panel at Thanksgiving in 2003 and asked Warren to make one for his wife's bathroom remodel. Warren thought about it through December and into January and then said yes. He charged $400 for a panel that took him 90 hours to build. He was aware of what the math said, because he knew how to add and divide. He also understood that the $400 was not the purpose of the transaction. Not yet. The material had cost him nothing. The time was time he would have spent in the barn anyway, because that was where he spent his evenings and weekends in winter, when the setting work slowed. What the commission gave him was not income. It was a specification. Somebody else's wall, somebody else's light, somebody else's color preferences, and the requirement that the finished work had to function in a context he had not chosen. That was a different problem than working for himself, and it taught him things the first panel had not. The hopper panel went up in a bathroom in Boonville in the spring of 2004. Dale drove out the following fall and stood in Warren's barn for a while and looked at what was on the sorting racks and said he thought his wife's sister might want one for the kitchen backsplash she was having rebuilt. Warren said he would think about it. He did not advertise. He had no website and no business cards and no particular plan for acquiring more commissions. He continued his tile-setting work through the early 2000s, driving out to new construction and renovation sites in Meade and Hardin counties, and he continued sorting the seconds in the barn in the evenings and on weekends, and occasionally someone saw what was on the racks and asked about a piece, and Warren built it and charged what seemed fair and went back to work. He made perhaps 8 commissions between 2004 and 2008, none for more than $600, none that he would have described to anyone as a business. He had a notebook where he recorded the commissions, the color palette he had used, and the dimensions and what he had charged, because Elias had kept a notebook and Warren had grown up understanding that the record was part of the work. The notebook had 53 entries by the time Douglas Fenn drove out in the spring of 2009. The year Douglas Fenn drove out to the fence was 2009, and it arrived in the middle of a recession that had hammered residential construction and taken most of the setting work with it. Warren was 61 years old and had fewer day jobs than at any point in the previous 2 decades. The factory's announcement that the seconds line would be discontinued was the worst timing he could have imagined, not because the material was irreplaceable, but because it came at the moment he had the most time to use it. He had completed perhaps a dozen commission pieces by that point. Panels in 3 or 4 houses in the county, one installed in a small restaurant in Elizabethtown that a friend of Dale Hopper's owned. Nothing that constituted a business by any measurable standard. Douglas Fenn was not wrong about the hobby classification. He simply did not know what the hobby was built on. Warren's grandson, Cole, came out in the summer of 2011, 2 years after Fenn's visit, fresh from completing a business degree at Western Kentucky University. Cole was 22, sharp, and genuinely fond of his grandfather, and he sat at the kitchen table with a yellow notepad and went through what he had observed in the barn with the earnestness of someone who has just acquired a vocabulary for a problem and is eager to apply it. The problem, Cole said, was margin. At the rates Warren was charging for commissions, even tripling his output, he would never clear anything that functioned as income. What he needed was a product line, not commissions on demand. He needed replicable panels in standard sizes that could be photographed and cataloged, listed with minimum order quantities, offered to kitchen and bath studios as a sourced material rather than a custom job. He needed to stop being a craftsman and start being a brand. He used those exact words, and he meant them as encouragement. He was not wrong about the economics. He was describing a real path, a path that many craft producers had walked successfully. And the frameworks he had spent 4 years acquiring told him that Warren was sitting on something that needed to be professionalized rather than protected. What Cole could not yet see, because he had not had the years to see it, was that the product Warren was making was made from variation that could not be standardized, and that standardizing the process around it would require either accepting that the panels would differ from order to order, which was a truth Warren had already accepted, or sourcing from a controlled supply, which was not what they had. Warren had spent 15 years learning to manage variation as an asset. Cole had spent 4 years learning to manage variation as a defect. They were working from different premises, and the premises were genuinely different. Neither one was wrong. One of them was simply closer to the material. Warren listened to all of it. He refilled Cole's coffee. He asked one question, which was whether Cole thought the panels he had been commissioning were identical to one another. Cole said they were not. Warren said that was correct, and that the reason they were not was that the material they were made from was not identical, and that the material's variation was not a quality problem to be solved, but was the thing that a certain kind of buyer would eventually pay for, and that building a catalog of product lines would require a supply of consistent material that the factory's reject stream could not reliably provide, because the factory's reject stream varied with production runs and glaze cycles and seasonal atmospheric conditions in the kiln, and that was not a bug. Cole listened, and then he said he still thought Warren was approaching it wrong. Warren agreed to disagree. Cole left at the end of August for a job in Nashville with a building materials distributor, and he thought his grandfather was stubborn. He was right. He was also, at 22, working from a set of frameworks that were correct in their own domain, but that did not account for what was happening in the barn. What was happening in the barn was not a failure to understand branding. It was a patient, extremely specific accumulation of a material library that could not be manufactured on demand and could not be replicated at scale, and that was going to become worth something at the moment the market caught up to what Warren already knew. The formal supply agreement came in 2014, after a change in ownership brought a new plant manager who was willing to sit across a table and discuss the seconds arrangement as a commercial matter. Warren drove to the plant one morning in April and spent 40 minutes with the manager, a man named Gary Potts, who was primarily interested in simplifying his disposal costs. They settled on 3 cents per pound, with the factory responsible for palletizing the material to the fence line. Warren drove home and bought the first load, roughly 1,400 pounds, for $42. The first shipment under the formal agreement included something Warren had not seen before from the line. The plant had taken on a specialty contract run, a handcrafted finish wall tile intended for the high-end residential market, a product engineered to look as though it had been pressed and glazed by hand rather than by machine. The rejection rate on that run was 38%, because the handmade look specification was genuinely difficult to achieve with factory equipment. The seconds from that run were visually almost identical to the approved product. They had the same intentional irregularity, the same slight surface relief, the same glazed character that the specification called for. The difference between the approved tile and the rejected tile was, in most cases, a millimeter of size variation or a minor inconsistency in glaze density that the factory's quality inspection process had flagged. To a designer who was buying handmade look tile for a high-end residential project, those distinctions were invisible. What was visible was the surface. What the surface carried was exactly what the specification had asked for, which was the appearance of a thing made by a person rather than a machine. Warren had 2,000 pounds of it within the year, purchased at 3 cents per pound, and stacked in the barn in careful, sorted order. There's a line of thinking in craft markets, and it runs through most of the conversations that happen around handmade goods. The argument is that the premium buyers pay for handmade work is premium for authenticity, and that authenticity cannot be substituted. What makes a handmade tile is that a person made it, and no amount of machine-achieved irregularity removes the category difference between the two. This is largely correct as a principle. It is also a principle that, applied honestly, draws a circle around genuine production variation of the kind that Warren's supply stream contained. because genuine production variation is not simulated variation. It is the actual record of an actual process. The crawl on a glaze that crawled during production is the crawl that physics produced. The color shift in a batch fired in a variable atmosphere is the color shift that chemistry produced. These are not simulated effects. They are what happen. Warren had been sitting on this understanding for 15 years by the time anyone else started to see it. The kitchen and bath studio that changed the scale of his operation was named Hartfield Surface, and it was located in Owensboro. The owner, a woman named Patrice, had been supplying residential renovation projects in western Kentucky for 12 years and had been fighting the same problem that every mid-market studio in the region was navigating, which was that the clients who wanted something that looked handmade were priced out of genuinely imported artisan tile and were being offered machine-pressed tile with simulated handmade finishes as a substitute, and most of them could tell the difference even if they could not explain it. She saw Warren's work at a small craft exhibition in Bowling Green in the fall of 2015. He had been persuaded to show at the exhibition by the woman who ran the Elizabethtown restaurant, where his panel had been installed 6 years earlier, who had seen other people stop in front of it and ask where it came from. Warren brought 4 panels and a folding table and a card that had his name and a phone number on it, and no other description, because he had not worked out what description was accurate. Patrice stood at his table for a while and picked up 3 different panels and held each one at different angles, the way someone does when they are looking at light behavior rather than looking at a pattern. She did not say anything for about 2 minutes. Then she asked 2 questions. The first was whether he could produce to a specified color range on a consistent basis. He said he could, with the caveat that the range would be similar across orders, but not identical, because each production run at the factory had its own atmospheric history. The second question was whether he could provide installations documentation for her studio's installers. He said he could build that within a month. She placed an order the following week for 6 panels for a client kitchen renovation. The client paid Hartfield Surface $2,300 for the 6 panels. Warren received $1,900 of that. It was the largest single-tile transaction of his life. He had spent 3 weeks building the panels using material that had cost him approximately $11 in raw tile. He was 67 years old, and this was his first genuinely commercial sale, and he drove home in the dark on a Thursday evening and told Ruth about it at the kitchen table. She said good and went back to her book. That was the appropriate response. Neither of them made more of it than it was, because making more of something than it was had never been the way things got built in that house. Patrice referred him to a second studio in 2016 and a third in 2018, and by the time the renovation market began its pandemic acceleration in the spring of 2020, Warren was supplying 4 studios at irregular intervals, building panels in the barn with help from one part-time neighbor, a retired tile setter named Glenn, and selling assembled work at an average of $280 per panel. Let me tell you what had changed in the market during those years, because it is part of what made 2020 different from 2016, and the difference matters. The renovation market in the Mid-South had been absorbing a gradual shift in buyer preference for what the design press called authentic materials, a category that included reclaimed wood, handcrafted ceramic, natural stone with visible variation, and products that carried some legible record of their origin. The shift was not universal, and it was not sudden. It was the kind of change that happens when a generation of buyers who have spent a decade living with high-gloss, large format, perfectly uniform surfaces begins to want the opposite. And when the design publications they read start treating surface authenticity as a value worth paying for. The studios that supplied the renovation market in this region had been navigating the gap between what their clients wanted and what the market actually offered since at least 2014. The handmade look category was real and the demand for it was growing, but the product supply was limited. Genuinely handmade ceramic from American craft producers was expensive and slow to source, with lead times that a renovation project could rarely accommodate. Imported artisan tile from Portugal and Morocco and Spain was available, but the pricing put it above what most residential clients could absorb in a kitchen backsplash or bathroom surround. Into that supply gap, several large retail tile operations had moved with machine-engineered products designed to mimic handmade variation, pressing texture and color inconsistency into tile bodies using programmed mold patterns that simulated the look of handcraft without the process of it. This product was available, affordable, and reliably identical from order to order. The problem was that it looked exactly like what it was, not to everyone. To most buyers in a showroom, the machine-pressed handmade look tile was persuasive. To the designers who worked in the segment that Patrice served, the segment that was paying for a renovation that would be photographed and published in regional design media, the mold-pressed variation was legible as mold-pressed variation because it repeated. The pattern of irregularity was identical across every tile in the box. Real variation does not repeat. Real variation is the record of a process that happened once, in those specific atmospheric conditions, with that specific clay body in that particular position in the kiln. Warren Supply was genuine variation. He had no way to market that distinction beyond the work itself, and the work itself was the argument, because a designer who held one of his panels and held a machine-pressed imitation of the same aesthetic next to it could see the difference in the light behavior. The machine-pressed tile had its pattern of variation laid into a mold and repeated across the production run. Warren's panels had the actual physics of an actual production process, sorted and assembled by a man who had spent 30 years learning to read them. These were not equivalent products, and in the segment where the distinction mattered, the distinction had begun to drive purchasing decisions in a way it had not 5 years earlier. The pandemic renovation wave that began in the spring of 2020 accelerated all of this. When residential spending shifted toward renovation rather than new construction, the clients who had been postponing the projects they actually wanted moved them forward, and the designers who worked with those clients found themselves fielding requests for materials that the commodity tile market could not satisfy. Patrice's order volume in the first 6 months of 2020 was 40% higher than the same period in 2019. She needed sources she could rely on. Phil Brock drove out from the plant in early 2020 to review the scrap arrangement. He was 48 years old and had a degree in operations management from a program in Ohio, and he had arrived at the plant the previous year with the view that the informal agreements accumulated by previous managers were a compliance liability that needed to be resolved. He came with a printed summary of the factory's secondary material disposal costs and a proposal to route all rejects to a certified ceramics recycler in Indianapolis, which would generate a small credit against disposal costs and produce documentation for the plant's environmental compliance file. Warren listened to the whole proposal, sitting across the kitchen table, with Rye, a brindle mutt with one white ear, stretched out under the table at his feet. Then he asked what the factory's current average monthly volume of rejects was across all lines. Brock checked his summary and said approximately 19,000 pounds per month. Warren said he would pay 6 cents per pound, double the current rate, collect by appointment on his own schedule using his own truck, and generate a signed receipt for each pickup that Brock could use for the same compliance documentation the Indianapolis recycler would provide. The certified recycler was offering a 2 cent per pound credit. Warren's offer was a 6 cent per pound payment, incoming revenue rather than outgoing cost, with no handling burden on the plant's dock. Brock drove back to the factory and called the plant owner, and the agreement was formalized in July 2020. Cole came back into the picture that fall. He was 31, and the 9 years he had spent in distribution had given him a fluency with logistics and supplier relationships and inventory management that his business degree had gestured at, but not delivered. He knew how product moved through a supply chain. He knew what a reliable supplier looked like, and what an unreliable one looked like, and what the difference cost a buyer over time. Warren called him in October and asked him to come out for a weekend and spend some time in the barn. Cole drove up from Nashville on a Friday afternoon, arriving in the early evening in a car that was newer than anything Warren had driven in 20 years, and they ate supper and talked about the hotel commission, and the following morning they went to the barn. Cole had not been inside the barn for several years. The last time he had been there seriously, with his yellow notepad in 2011, it had been a collection, a well-organized collection, sorted and stacked and labeled, but a collection. What he found now was different in kind, not just in scale. The wall racks held sorted tile in labeled bins organized by color family, surface character, and defect type. Each bin was marked with a hand-lettered index card in Warren's small, deliberate script. The finished panels occupied a separate section of the barn, stored flat in labeled wall-mounted bins, each one tagged with a reference number and a color notation. The reference numbers ran to 42 active entries. Cole walked down the row slowly and read each one. He walked back and read them again. He stood at the end of the row for a moment. Then he told Warren that he had a product line. Warren said he knew. He had known it for about 3 years, he said. He had been waiting for the order volume to confirm what the sorting system was ready for. Cole drove back to Nashville on Sunday and gave his notice the following week. He was in Meade County by March 2021 and did not go back. Cole drove back to Nashville and gave his notice the following week. He was in Meade County by March 2021 and did not leave. What Cole brought was what Warren had never had, which was not a vision for the product, but a fluency with the language that brought buyers to the barn rather than requiring Warren to seek them out. Cole built a documentation system for the panels, photographed each catalog reference under consistent lighting, wrote installation guidance for each surface type, and established a pricing structure that reflected the actual labor and material cost with a sustainable margin attached. He reached back out to Patrice at Hartfield Surface and to each of the 3 other studios in Warren's network and asked what they needed to place larger and more regular orders. What they needed, it turned out, was reliability of supply and documentation. The product itself was already what they wanted. Cole provided the surrounding structure, the order forms, the lead time estimates, the panel specifications, and the follow-up after installation. By the summer of 2021, Warren and Cole were supplying 6 studios and had added 2 part-time workers trained by Warren in the sorting and cutting process. The hotel commission arrived in late 2021 through a design firm in Louisville that had worked with Hartfield Surface on a boutique hotel renovation. The firm's project director was a woman named Lena who had spent a decade sourcing materials for hospitality interiors and who had developed a precise calibration for the difference between surfaces that looked interesting in a photograph and surfaces that held their character over years of use and changing light conditions. She drove out to the barn in December 2021 and spent the better part of an afternoon handling panel samples. She asked Warren one question, which was whether there was any possibility of replicating a specific palette exactly in a future order if the client wanted to expand the installation later. Warren said no, and he explained why in 3 sentences. The reject stream changed with each production run. The palette would be similar, but not identical. Exact replication was not possible without a controlled production run, which was not what they were sourcing. Lena said that was the correct answer. She said it without elaboration. She signed the contract in January 2022. The lobby installation covered 640 square feet of wall surface in a paneled mosaic design. Cole negotiated the final contract at $47,000 for the assembled panels, with installation subcontracted separately. Warren and 2 assistants built the panels over 11 weeks, drawing from 7 pallet deliveries of factory seconds, totaling approximately 3,570 pounds of material. The raw tile cost was $214. The invoice was paid in full in July 2022. Cole ran the margin calculation on a Tuesday evening and printed the summary sheet the following morning. He drove out to Meade County on Wednesday. He put the summary on the kitchen table in the afternoon and said Warren should look at it. The raw tile for the 640 square foot installation had cost $214. That was the material cost. 3 months of palletized deliveries from the factory at 6 cents per pound. Approximately 3,570 pounds of ceramic seconds had provided all the tile body for the project. The remaining costs, labor, tooling depreciation, Cole's commission, and the overhead on the barn operation had been absorbed within the project margin. The profit on that single contract was just over $31,000. Warren read the sheet twice. He sat with it for a moment. Then he got up and washed his cup at the sink, which was what he did when something needed to settle before he said anything about it. He stood at the sink and looked out the window at the barn for a while, at the extended section he had built the previous winter, at the pallets stacked along the east wall. Then he came back to the table. Ruth came in from the garden with her gloves still on, carrying the small basket she used for the kitchen herbs. Warren picked up the paper and handed it to her without saying anything. She pulled off one glove and took the sheet. She stood at the counter and read it. She held it for a longer time than it would have taken to read it once. Then she set it on the counter and said she thought it was something. She had used those words about the first panel in 2003, the one hanging on the kitchen wall that they were both standing within view of. The first panel had cost Warren $400 in commission and 90 hours of labor and had paid him back nothing financially, and had been the thing that told him the direction was right. She had said the same thing about it then that she said about the invoice now. She had not been wrong in 2003 either. Rye was under the table, his chin on his forepaws. Cole had not expected Warren to say much about the number. He had known his grandfather long enough by then to know that the number was not the surprise. What the number represented was the arithmetic confirmation of a thing Warren had understood for 28 years, an arithmetic confirmation of something you already know does not produce the reaction that a surprise produces. What it produces is a small, quiet satisfaction and a return to work. The first thing Warren said after he came back from the sink was that he needed to call Glenn about the following week's delivery schedule, because there was a commission panel due for a studio in Bowling Green, and the material he had sorted for it needed to be checked against the reference sample before they started cutting. Cole said he would make the call. Warren went out to the barn. $31,420 of margin on $214 of raw material. Douglas Fenn had been retired from the ceramics consulting business for 3 years by then. Cole had been reading through the journal by then, the cracked leather volume Elias had kept on the pressing line, which Cole had carried out of the barn one afternoon and brought inside to read under the kitchen light. He had been reading it slowly over several months, stopping on the passages where Elias described thinking through a defect, working out the mechanism of it, writing down what the piece was telling him about the process that made it. Near the middle of the journal, in an entry from the early 1970s, Elias had written that the factory knew how to make things right, and that was useful knowledge, and he respected it. What it did not know how to do was make things that were right in a different way. That was what the barn was for, Elias wrote. He had not explained further. He had not needed to. Cole photographed every page of the journal with a camera borrowed from a student at the University of Louisville Art School who was doing a documentary project on regional craft traditions. The images were archived in a digital file. The original journal went back to the barn in a fireproof tin that Cole bought in Elizabethtown. Warren read one passage of the digital version on Cole's laptop one evening in February 2023, sitting at the kitchen table under the hanging light. He did not read the whole thing. He knew the whole thing. He read the passage from the early 1970s and sat with it for a while. Phil Brock came out to renegotiate in September 2022, having heard about the hotel commission through the plant's sales contacts. He arrived with a revised pricing proposal, and he and Cole sat at the table for an hour going through it. They settled at 8 cents per pound with an exclusivity clause covering all the plant's secondary output. Brock shook Cole's hand and drove back to the factory. On the drive, he called his operations supervisor and said he was not certain he had negotiated effectively. He had not. He was also, as Warren might have said, simply working from the price the market was showing him. And the market's view of that material had taken 28 years to build. By the fall of 2023, Warren and Cole employed 3 part-time workers, had expanded the barn by 30 feet, and were supplying studios in Kentucky, Tennessee, and southern Indiana. 2 inquiries from regional distributors who wanted to place the panels in wider retail had been declined, because the volume those contracts required would have exceeded what the supply stream and the labor available could reliably produce at the quality standard Warren was maintaining. Cole had analyzed both inquiries and agreed with the refusal, which was something Warren noted without comment. A second hospitality commission from a referral by Lena's design firm was in discussion when this was written. There are 2 ways to look at a pile of ceramic rejects. One way says the pile contains material that the production process correctly identified as below standard, and the correct response is disposal. The other way says the pile contains a record of what happened inside that kiln during those particular firing cycles, information that the quality control process collected and then discarded. And that information has a value to someone who knows how to read it. The first reading requires no particular knowledge. Any person with a clipboard and a quality spec sheet can apply it in 20 minutes. The second reading requires decades of attention to one process, a journal written by a man who paid that attention before you, a barn where you have time to think, and a willingness to work from what you understand rather than from what is legible to the person with the clipboard. The second reading also requires patience of a specific kind, not the patience of waiting for something to happen, but the patience of continuing to learn from something that the world has decided is not worth learning from. Elias Creel paid attention on the pressing floor for 22 years and wrote it down. Warren paid attention in the barn for 30 more and built from it. Cole is paying attention now, and the journal has been archived, and the work continues, and the barn is 30 feet longer than it was when Fenn drove out in his company truck. What is measured by the factory is not everything that is there. What is discarded is not always without value. What a system cannot read, it calls waste. Warren Creel read what the factory could not, and what he built from it outlasted the consultant's clipboard by 13 years and counting, and the proof of it covers 640 square feet of wall in a lobby in Louisville, and rise at his feet.